Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session on aphasia assessment and intervention. My name is Lottie Metyard. I'm really excited to see the three talks that we've got today. Remember, all talks are recorded and will be on the platform for 6 months. Unfortunately, we don't have time for a Q&A with the speakers, but please post your questions in the conference platform Q&A box. We'll ask the speakers to post their replies to those questions so you'll be able to see them. So without further ado, and to make sure that we stay on time, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Claire Mills for the first talk.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Claire Mills. I'm the clinical lead speech and language therapist at the Royal Brompton and Harefield Hospitals, which is part of Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Foundation Trust. I'm really grateful for the RCSLT organising committee for the opportunity to present the European Stroke Organisation guidelines for aphasia rehabilitation. I'm presenting these guidelines on behalf of the Aphasia Rehabilitation Guideline Working Group. And I'm hoping that by the end of this session, you'll understand some of the key recommendations for aphasia rehabilitation to implement into clinical practice, that you'll understand the approach that we took to develop these guidelines and the evidence base underlying them. And I'll briefly talk through the critical next steps for research in this area. So these are our disclosures, which you can look back on if you want to have a closer look at and watch back the video. And this is shows the guideline working group members. We were a multidisciplinary and international group. The two co-chairs for the working group were Professor Marion Brady and Professor Katerina Hillary. And I'm grateful to Professor Marion Brady for the opportunity to act as research fellow on this project. The whole group are very grateful to the European Stroke Organisation for their support in delivering these guidelines. Aphasia impacts approximately a third of people after stroke, and when compared to individuals that don't develop aphasia, individuals who do develop aphasia have much poorer functional outcomes, poorer psychosocial outcomes, lower well-being. They often receive fewer pain medication and are less likely to receive screening for continence issues. Fewer of them return to work and fewer of them return home. So it's clear that it's a really important clinical priority for us to improve how effective our aphasia rehabilitation is, not just for their improvements in language and quality of life, but for all those other aspects of rehabilitation that aphasia impacts. Published back in 2023, Bagwat et al. Carried out a systematic review looking at all of the RCTs that had been conducted internationally since 2012, specifically focusing on usual care and what that looked like. And what we saw in this review is that SLT input for aphasia varies hugely internationally. It can range from 15 minutes to 15 hours per week. The dosage can range from 4 to 100 hours of SLT. Duration can range from 1 to 52 weeks. And session number of sessions or days delivered per week can vary from none to 5 days. In 2018, ESO published an action plan for stroke, and two key priority research questions were identified. Firstly, how can rehabilitation be implemented with evidence-based results on timing, on level and type of intervention? And secondly, can post-stroke language problems be managed more effectively? And we know that since this, there have been more and more large international randomised controlled trials, and some of them are outlined there, Compare, Verse3, etc. And also, one of the really impactful studies that has been published was the Release, which was an individual participant data network meta-analysis, pulling together 174 data sets from 28 different countries and included almost 6,000 participants. And that looked at how important SLT was in terms of the frequency, and that was defined as therapy days per week, the intensity, the number of hours per week, and then the dosage, so the total therapy hours delivered. And they recommended a critical therapeutic range on the basis of that. ESO then prioritised aphasia rehabilitation guideline development, and this work, as I said, was led by Professor Marion Brady and Professor Katharina Hillary. We followed standard ESO, standard operating procedures, and that involved updating an evidence synthesis as the basis for the recommendations. We also used the GRADE framework, which, if you're not familiar with, that's the way of us evaluating the quality of the evidence and describing the strength of the recommendations. So that's rated from high, where our confidence in the estimate of the effect is very strong, and further research is unlikely to change that confidence, down to very low, where we're very uncertain about the estimate and we do need more research. So the working group firstly developed a list of 10 research questions, and we used the PICO framework, patient intervention comparison outcomes, and those questions sat into two areas. Firstly, the aphasia rehabilitation schedule, that included dose, intensity, and frequency. And secondly, comparing delivery, so group versus one-to-one, digital versus in-person, and then tailored SLT intervention by functional relevance and level of language difficulty compared to non-tailored. And then finally, research question was on transcutaneous direct current stimulation with SLT. The working group took a Delphi approach to deciding the critical outcomes for inclusion, rating a range of different outcomes from 1 to 9. And the list that you see here are those outcomes that were deemed to be critical for inclusion. Obviously, because of the time constraints of this talk, I'm not going to be able to talk you through all of the outcomes, but I'm going to focus on the ones in red. And those are the outcomes for post-intervention, functional communication, and quality of life. You can see here our PRISMA for PICOs 1 to 5 and 7, so not including TDCS. We updated, we did the searches from 2015, so updating a recent Cochrane review, and we identified 4,136 records, and then included 28, and that included those from the previous Cochrane review. For TDCS, our review was from 2018, also based incorporating data from a previous review, and we identified 864 records and included 17. So for each of our PICO, we carried out risk of bias for each of the RCTs. And you can see here for PICO 1 an example of this. And you can see generally for PICO 1, the risk of bias was relatively low, apart from for D3, which is blinding of participants and personnel. And that's fairly common for rehabilitation, particularly aphasia rehabilitation, where it's very difficult to blind participants and clinical staff. What you'll see as I present some of our results is that this risk of bias is presented within the forest plot for each of our PICOs. So to start to present some of the results, PICO 1 compared higher dose of SLT, which was defined as more than 20 hours or more, with lower dose SLT, and looked at whether there was an associated improvement in terms of functional communication. For those of you that aren't familiar with forest plots, this is a way of presenting graphically and summarising a meta-analysis. So the squares that you see show the effect size of the individual studies, and then the diamond at the bottom shows the overall pooled effect size from the meta-analysis. And if that diamond lies on the line, then it's a sign that there's no significant difference between the different treatments. And if it lies on one side, then it shows that there is an effect size for one of the interventions. So here what we can see is that that diamond does lie on the line. The confidence interval shows you that it goes over the line into the negative. So there was no significant difference for a higher dose for functional communication. However, when looking at quality of life, higher dose was favoured. So it does seem to improve quality of life. Our recommendations for PICO-1 were that we recommended high dose SLT interventions rather than lower dose SLT. Moving on to PICO-2, which looked at higher intensity of SLT, which was defined as 3 or more hours per week. That we can see here did favour that higher intensity SLT compared to lower intensity for functional communication. However, for quality of life, there was no significant difference between high intensity and low intensity. So our recommendation for PICO-2 is to suggest high intensity SLT rather than lower intensity. For PICO-3, we were looking at a higher frequency of SLT compared to lower frequency, with higher frequency being defined as 4 or more days per week. And here we can see for functional communication, there was no significant difference. And similarly, for quality of life, we see no significant difference with it crossing the line. Overall, our recommendations for PICO-3 are to suggest higher frequency SLT rather than lower frequency SLT. For PICO 4A, we compared digitally delivered SLT, and that could be telerehabilitation, virtual reality, or something similar to that, and compared that to usual in-person SLT. And we saw for functional communication, there was no difference. Our recommendation for this PICO was to suggest using either in-person or digitally delivered SLT. For PICO 4B, we were comparing in-person SLT plus digital augmentation. So that could be computer or tablet-based software, virtual reality, or something similar, and comparing that to usual in-person SLT. And for functional communication, we saw no significant difference. Our recommendation for this area was we suggested in-person SLT plus digital augmentation rather than usual in-person SLT. For PICO 5, we were comparing group SLT compared to one-to-one, and for functional communication saw no significant difference. For PICO 5, we suggested using either one-to-one or group therapy. And for this PICO, we also developed an expert consensus statement, and that was voted by our voting members of our working group, and they voted unanimously to the consensus statement that the decision on the format of the intervention can be made in reference to the health service context and the resources that are available. For PICO 5, we were comparing one-to-one plus group SLT compared to one-to-one SLT alone. And we saw both for functional communication and quality of life that there was no significant difference. Our recommendations for this were that the benefits of providing one-to-one plus group SLT compared to one-to-one SLT alone are uncertain, and therefore we can't make a recommendation. However, again, we did write an expert consensus statement on which 100% of the voting members agreed on. And that was that where access to one-to-one therapy is constrained by resource availability, group therapy can be delivered in addition to facilitate increased therapy time, give additional opportunities for individuals to use language in a social context, and enhance their communication confidence. And we also suggested that the timing and format of therapy should follow other recommendations in the guidelines to help improve outcomes.
About 3 minutes left, Claire.
The PICO 6 compared SLT plus TDCS compared to SLT plus sham, and we did a range of different options for TDCS, but I'm just going to present the left hemisphere anodal TDCS. And we can see here that for functional communication, there was no significant difference. For this PICO, we recommended that the benefits of SLT plus TDCS are uncertain and we can't make a recommendation. We developed two expert consensus statements. The first that 10 of 12 agreed on, and the second that there was 100% agreement on. And that was that in a clinical context, SLT should be delivered alone rather than alongside TDCS, but that individualised protocols may be beneficial, but we need further research in this area. Our final PICOs 7 and A was that individually tailored SLT by functional relevance compared to non-tailored SLT. There were no trials that looked at these tailored interventions, but the release network meta-analysis did show that there were gains from baseline for auditory comprehension only when individuals really receive functionally relevant SLT. And it also showed that there were higher gains when functionally relevant SLT were provided rather than non-tailored for language ability, naming, and functional communication. So we suggested tailored SLT by functional relevance rather than non-tailored. And 7B looked at tailoring by language difficulty, and that found no difference. So our recommendations were to suggest individually tailored SLT by level of language difficulty. So in summary, aphasia rehabilitation should be frequent, at least 4 times a week. It should be intensive, at least 3 hours per week. It should be at a sufficient dose of at least 20 hours of SLT. It should be functionally relevant to the person, and it should be at a sufficient level of language task difficulty. And it can be augmented digitally or by group-based provision. Quickly, some areas of future research. It's clear there's much more research needed in this area. There are and is a need for larger trials with high quality methodology that use core outcome sets that describe demographics, and we need to improve our follow-up of patient data for a year or more. And improve our outcome measures. You can access the guidelines via the QR code, and I just want to thank again for the opportunity to present these recommendations on behalf of the working group. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Anna Court and Dr. Bundy McIntosh. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Claire. So I'm delighted to be here today with my colleague, Dr. McIntosh, to talk about the HARP Aphasia study. This is a recently finished NIHR-funded study, which has been exploring the opportunities and challenges of using smart camera apps as communication aids in aphasia therapy. So an overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to give an introduction to aphasia and assistive technology and what smart camera technology is, and then talk about the HARP Aphasia study. So the aims and some key findings from our scoping review, the methods and the overall findings. So previous research has shown that assistive technology can be harnessed to facilitate reading and writing for people with aphasia. And this assistive technology is typically developed either through a general or business market, such as Kindle e-readers or voice recognition software, or for people with dyslexia, or for people with visual impairment. And previous research has shown that e-readers and dyslexia software can be used by people with aphasia to help them with reading, and the benefits mean that it can help people get back into reading books, to reading websites, news and emails. There's also been research showing that using technology can help people attend and take part in book groups, so engaging with the social aspects of reading. And the improvements have been observed in reading speed, comprehension and confidence and emotions associated with reading. But there are some aspects of reading that these technologies aren't so useful for, particularly things like reading on paper, the letters that come through your door, or reading when you're out and about in the community. So this is where there's a potential role for smart camera technology. So this is technology that uses computer vision, a type of artificial intelligence, and it converts visual information into language. It uses optical character recognition to capture text and read that, and it can read aloud. It can also describe visual information aloud. And the technology was designed for people with visual impairments, but it may also be useful for people with aphasia, for reading and other aspects of communication. The specific things it can do are it can read text, and it can read both printed and handwritten texts out loud. It can also highlight text as you go. It can describe objects and scenes. It can describe faces, or it can be trained to recognize specific faces. And it can scan barcodes on products and identify items. It's available as apps. And some of these focus on the reading features. So examples of those are Prismo Go or Speechify. But other apps include the full range of smart camera features, including Seeing AI and Envision AI. And these apps are available on Apple and Android smartphones, and they're often free. Sometimes they have a subscription cost, but if they do, it's not usually very high. So here's an example of some of the smart camera features on the app Seeing AI. So this video shows used to read a short piece of text.
Sign in book here. All visitors must sign in.
So the app automatically captures text when it sees it and reads it aloud. It can also be used to describe things. So here we see it describing.
Describe. Processing. The image shows a single pen placed horizontally on a flat, white surface.
You can see it gives very long and detailed descriptions, but then you can ask it to simplify that information by asking it to give you one word or a summary or a sentence.
Pen.
It can also describe or recognize faces.
More. Person. One face and a near top edge, less than a meter away.
So it can be trained to recognize faces, and it also describes where the person is, which is because it's designed for people with visual impairments who might find that information useful. And lastly, barcode scanning. So it looks at the barcode.
More. Product. Processing. Ribena blackcurrant bottle 500 megaliters.
Once it captures the barcode, it then writes and says what it is. So the HARP aphasia study was exploring the potential for this technology to be used in aphasia therapy. And there were two aims. Firstly, to identify current use of the technology in communication disabilities and rehabilitation. And for this, we carried out a scoping review. Secondly, to develop a new therapy using the apps, and we used participatory health methods. We worked with people with aphasia and speech and language therapists and assistants, aiming to develop therapy that would improve spoken language and also reading comprehension. So some key findings from the scoping review were that there's very little research done about this type of technology. Most of it has been done with people with visual impairments, but even there's not very much research. There are some studies, but they tend to be quite small, with a median size of 11 participants. Some studies have researched smart glasses. Some have compared smart glasses and smartphone apps. And some of the key benefits that have been identified of smart camera apps are that they're very affordable, they're inconspicuous because everybody's using smartphones, and they're very widely available. So the study aimed to develop to explore how the technology could be used by people with aphasia, and then develop therapy resources and a manual for using the technology to help with communication skills. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Bundy.
It's a group, 12 people with aphasia and 6 language therapies, and then walking interviews, 12 people with race and nobody else, and workshops 12 people with aphasia and 9 speech and language therapists. And because the mild aphasia and moderate aphasia and severe aphasia all in separate groups, and speech and language therapists took part in groups 1 and 4, and the workshops the same. Language groups 1 and 3 and 4 has speech and language therapists. And the focus groups, we asked people with communication difficulties using technology and possibly using smart camera apps. We asked people to rate different apps. We asked people think about how apps could be used in therapy, and we asked people their views on therapy materials. The workshops afterwards, people tried using the sections in the therapy manual. They shared their views about how useful and relevant the activities were, and they gave us feedback on how we can improve the materials. And rating, 5 the ratings are up and down and in between. Analyzed concepts on field notes, looked for key messages and patterns.
Okay, so then now I'm going to present some key findings. So in the second focus group, we asked people with aphasia to try out a short list of 3 apps and to compare how usable they were and identify a preferred one. We showed them 3 apps, Seeing AI, Envision AI, and Google Lens, and there was a clear favourite that 9 out of 11 people preferred Seeing AI. Seeing AI and Envision AI are quite similar, but Seeing AI worked better and more reliably. We also decided to include Google Lens because it offered something different, which was a huge range of different languages, and also that it could translate between languages. And we had participants who tried the app out in other languages, including Nepalese and Swahili. In the third focus group, participants, both people with aphasia and speech and language therapists, generated ideas about how the technology could be used. And they came up with a huge range of different ideas. A lot of these were around ideas for getting around language difficulties, such as someone who finds reading difficult, using it to listen to text as well as reading. Other activities were to do with practicing language skills. So, for example, using it to practice saying target words or practice reading aloud. And lots of the ideas related to self-management and personalizing therapy, because it's a tool that can be used in someone's own environment to practice with their own sort of real resources, and it makes it much easier to create those resources to help with practice. So here are some specific ideas that people came up with. So ideas about reading included reading for information, such as letters, recipes, and street signs. People also thought it would be useful to get summaries of text, particularly sort of the long letters that often come through the post, where it can give you a really succinct summary of the key messages in that. And also to practice reading aloud by listening and reading along and then copying. An example of someone who attended the focus group who said that they had started using the app for reading were called Ali. So he was someone who previously relied on a family member to help him with all of his reading. But after attending the focus group, he asked a young relative to help him to learn to use the app. And he now uses it for reading letters, bills. It works for handwritten notes, and he uses it when he's shopping to read the small information about products, and also for reading emails. And he's using that independently for reading now. I saw him more recently after the research had finished, and he said he was also now using it to practice listening skills. So he finds that names, dates, and times difficult to understand, which is a problem when he's calling his GP. So he's been using the app to practice those skills. Ideas for therapy for speaking included practicing finding words and saying words using either the describe or the barcode scanning features, to practice saying people's names, and to practice lists of words, phrases, or conversation starters, or to practice conversations like script training, such as ordering a cup of coffee in a cafe. And those would be using the read feature of the app. An example of someone who told us that they'd used the app to help with speaking were called Teresa. She said her husband was going shopping and she wanted him to buy some carrots, but she couldn't find the word. So she used the app to go into the kitchen, find a carrot, which gave her the word, and then she could go back to her husband and ask him to buy some carrots, which she was pleased about. We also talked about what's challenging about using this app. And one of the things was changing the settings, which could be quite confusing. Another challenge was capturing all of the text that you want it to, but maybe not capturing text that you don't want it to read aloud, and that was particularly challenging for people who could only use one hand to hold the phone. Another key challenge that we saw earlier is that the descriptions are very long, and you can ask it to simplify that, but you need to use language to simplify it, so either by typing or dictating. Some of the facilitators where you could change the speed to a speed that suited you, and you could simplify the menu by removing features that you weren't planning to use. The participants gave us advice about how to develop resources to help people learn to use different functions. So for step-by-step written instructions, they recommended a landscape format with 3 steps per page, looking like this, with clear written instructions and arrows and circles showing where to tap for different functions. Other key facilitators were they recommended that we also develop videos, because some people don't find those written instructions very easy to follow. There were different views about whether the videos should include a voiceover or whether that was distracting, so they recommended we made 2 versions of videos, with one with a voiceover and one without. We also talked about what the therapy plan should look like, and they recommended that it should be 6 sessions of therapy plus an additional 2 if people needed more support with learning to use the technology. Home practice and carryover plans would be key, and also involving family members to support that carryover and support with problem solving with the technology were really important. They also advised us about having different levels of difficulty for therapy activities, such as having different types of questions for reading comprehension. At the workshops, we showed examples of the resources and got more detailed feedback on these materials. So an example of that was we showed some resources for script training, and the participants in the workshops recommended ways that we could present that make it easier for people to practice their own lines using the app. At the workshops, we also discussed with the speech and language therapists about how useful the different activities were, and there were different views here. So most of the speech and language therapists felt that all of the activities would be useful with some of the people they work with. Others felt there should be more focus on the reading and summarising features, as these were most likely to be useful. So in summary, Seeing AI was identified as the preferred app among participants with aphasia. The participants, speech and language therapists and people with aphasia, generated lots of ideas about how the app could be used to support reading and speaking. And our future plans are to apply for funding for a feasibility study next year. So this is our research team, our advisory group, and our steering group chair. And thank you to our funder, the NIHR. And thank you also to our research participants and to all the people who made the research possible by advising us or by referring people to the project. Contacts. So thank you. I'm now going to hand over to John Bentley.
Goodness me, I'm so sorry, everybody. My slides have just disappeared. Yeah, 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 they've just disappeared, but they're open. I have them open, but the window's not appearing. I'm so sorry. What's happening?
Hi everyone, we're just going to give John time to get his slides shared. Before we go back to his talk, I just want to flag that the Royal College are going to be updating their stroke guidance in the spring of 2026, and there'll be an opportunity to join the working group for that project. So please stay alert for any further announcements about that.
Matt, are you able to share mine that I shared with you?
And also, remember that you can keep posting your questions in the
Okay.
Q&A, and there's also
I'll
the
just
chat
try
box
again.
where you can
Okay,
leave
so if
feedback
I,
about sessions or speakers or conferences. That is all monitored though, so please be polite and respectful when posting your comments, as I'm sure you will be anyway. Hopefully we'll be able to go back to John soon.
Right. Okay, I'm so sorry, everybody. I've had to come out of my slides, go back in, and now I'm going to share them, and
Okay,
hopefully
I think we're
they will.
nearly there, everyone, so I'm just going to mute myself again.
And for some reason, they're just not coming up. I can't fathom it.
John's just struggling still to get his slides up, so if everyone can just bear with us, hopefully it won't take too much longer.
Okay, hi, I'm John Bentley. I'm a speech and language therapist working for a company called Provide, who are a community interest company in Essex. We deliver services to the NHS locally. And I'm here today to talk about how we have addressed the need to increase dose and intensity in the treatment of people with aphasia in Essex. So everything that Claire was speaking about earlier, that's essentially what we've been responding to. I'm going to first talk about the case for service reorganisation, just why we need to address this, and then I'm going to progress on to talking about how we did that in its first phase, a project that ran last year, and then how the learning points from that project have been applied to a new project that has actually, I'm very pleased to say, started yesterday. So firstly, the case for service reorganisation, it's everything that Claire said at the beginning of her talk, and a little bit more. So, languages are arguably our defining cognitive skill. We use it to fit in and explore ideas, solve problems, etc., to express our individualism, and to sort of gain self-worth. When we have impairments of language processing, then we find it difficult to maintain our relationships, even with people very close to us, and we struggle to participate societally and economically. And we know that the Lamb and Vodkis piece of research from 2010 that where aphasia came out as having the greatest negative relationship with poor long-term quality of life outcomes than any other medical condition, including cancer or dementia. We know that strokes are increasing. The incidence of stroke is increasing. The King research showed that it's going to be 60% higher in 2035 than it was in 2015, and more people are surviving stroke as well. And the statistic, 30% of people who have a stroke develop aphasia, and between 50 and 60% of those people will live with aphasia chronically beyond 1 year. We also know that there's a very significant evidence to practice gap ever since sort of 2003, and Bogle published her research and her colleagues' research, and that's been corroborated and expanded on since with and not least the release paper and the European Stroke Organisation's new guidelines that Claire talked about earlier that state sort of more than 20 hours and more than 4 days a week in terms of frequency. But I view that very much as a minimum standard. If we look at sort of how community services have altered over the past 30 years, if we go back to 1993, McKenzie et al. Found that 25% of people with aphasia were receiving more than 3 hours a week therapy. And that dwindled to 4.8 hours a week. So 4.8% of people with aphasia receiving more than 3 hours a week in 2003. Code and Heron found that. And the only sort of comparable statistic we have latterly is from Palmer et al. In 2018, who found that community services deliver sort of 6.3 hours on average to people with aphasia in a given 3-month period, and that interventions are often focused on compensation, which suggests that people recognise that it's very difficult to be effective with such infrequent and low dose interventions. It's also worth saying that Code and Heron attributed that decline in sort of intensive treatment to the increasing demands of dysphagia, and we'll come to that later in terms of our newer project and how that's trying to reorganise community services to release capacity. So I'm also very grateful and fortunate to have worked in a number of high dose, high intensity programs, not least the Queen's Square ICAP. And I have I'm kind of seasoned in that kind of service delivery, and very wedded to it as the kind of treatment of choice. If you think about learning theory and neuroplasticity, and it's really key that everything we know about that points to massed practice as being essential to behavioural change. So the very first thing we did in Essex, so was in response to this, was apply to NHS England's Squire Fund for Catalyst funding. We managed to be successful, and we proposed a bolt-on service. So this was two sort of experienced speech and language therapists and an assistant working across the whole of Mid and South Essex, which is a large area, and we were essentially bolted on to the existing integrated community stroke services. So we were supporting 3 acute hospitals, 3 with acute stroke wards, 3 ESD teams, and 2 stroke rehabilitation units, level 3 rehabilitation units. And we were trying to do it all. So we were trying to collect data on incidence of aphasia and outcomes. We were trying to train all the staff working in the stroke teams. We were providing support sessions to SLT colleagues. Central to everything, we were providing high dose groups. So people would receive 85 hours across a defined 4-week period. And because we were focused on the ICSS, we were having to respond to clusters of need, as people coming through the system. So we had to be mobile and flexible. So we kind of varied where we were. We didn't know where we were going to be month to month. We were doing family education sessions remotely with families of people with newly diagnosed aphasia. We were developing telerehabilitation programs and delivering them to increased dose. And we were also managing Q-Speak for people with aphasia, so holding the responsibility for sending out sessions. So we had licenses built into our budget and sending out sessions to people with aphasia across Essex. So we situated our groups in libraries for the simple reason that it's kind of drawing people into their own high streets, out of their homes, solving access issues, showing what people can do independently, helping their families appreciate how independent they can be. And also, on the high street, you've got sort of immediate access to all kinds of communication opportunities and challenges. So you can focus on a whole plethora of different impairment, and then take them out into the community and address use strategies to be more successful, using ATMs or self-service counters or whatever else. So this is my colleague Lydia Paley and Lisa Boyle supporting people in a constraint task, sort of language action therapy in a library in Essex. And we, talking about how we had to respond to need. These are the 10 groups that we managed in a year with this bolt-on service. So we had to coordinate leave in order to manage 10 groups in a year. So it's 29 people with aphasia that are receiving 85 hours of therapy in between sort of May 2024 and this year, May this year. So in terms of outcomes, we used a variety of formal, standardized and some informal methods to measure people's response to treatment. You should recognize this as the picture from the spoken picture description test in the CAT. This is the second edition. And we used this and scored it by the book to assess how well people were able to describe it. These were our findings. So, for the 29 people that we treated, you'll see that there's a big shift from the start of therapy at the left to the end of therapy in the middle. And then most of their treatment gains were maintained at the 3-month review period. So we reviewed everybody remotely 3 months after treatment. There's one person who struggled to make improvements, but he actually had an incredibly severe apraxia of speech and was largely non-verbal. We also used the communication confidence rating scale for aphasia. So we people rated their own confidence in 10 different scenarios at the beginning and at the end of therapy, and then again 3 months later. There was a little bit of drop off, mainly for people who returned to living situations that lacked communication opportunity. So this isn't ultra scientific, but we as I said, we assessed and monitored different domains of language processing and broader cognitive function, and we had good data for 2 people, only good data for 2 people who had been seen earlier in the system. So usually we lacked that level of assessment rigor, but for 2 people we had it. So this is a lady who we know that she had 3 hours of SLT between week 1 and 12 in a rehabilitation unit, and made this. This is the mean of her progress of all her scores, and then she had 2 hours of SLT between weeks 13 and 19, and then she had no SLT between 19 and 47, and then she had 21 hours of SLT with the group between 48 and 51, and made that much progress. And then similarly, this is a man who we know he had 2 hours of speech therapy when he was in the acute and on the SRU, and made that amount of progress. And he was in a level 1 neuro rehab centre between 8 and 20, and then was with us for 4 weeks between weeks 21 and 24. We also set goals that were weighted in accordance with the goal attainment scaling, and most people achieved their goals. They tended to be largely functional, And we monitored economic benefits, and there were sort of broader indirect economic benefits across the board. You know, people were sort of solving problems to come in and using public transport by themselves, shopping for themselves, etc. But we also found direct economic benefit with 2 people that we managed to negotiate early discharge from level 1 neuro rehab, because we could offer increased higher intensity, higher dose, and that had a cost saving associated. We also helped a 48-year-old lady get back to work as a healthcare assistant on a stroke ward, as it happened, as part of a graded return to working as a registered nurse. A 61-year-old lady, we managed to persuade her to take out a voluntary working position in a shop, and to increase her communication challenge and maintain her recovery. A 77-year-old man felt confident enough to return to work as a paid engineering consultant, and another lady returned to her previous role as a volunteer working with a learning disabilities charity. So we had universal, praise from people that went through the program, and I couldn't show it all, so I've picked one out. And this is from a wife of a gentleman who attended group. She said, to be frank, the therapy he got from the full-time inpatient unit, roughly an hour a day, just wasn't up to the job. His therapist was great, but she didn't have the time or the resources to do anything worthwhile. I'm certain that the intensive approach, the ongoing telephone practice, and the remote therapy from your assistant, and the support you provided with his work on QSpeak is effective and has made the difference. He can articulate his needs again, and he can read again. He's going from strength to strength. For me, there's no argument that your model is brilliant, and I'm sure it must save money in the long run. So it's a ringing endorsement. But unfortunately, okay, thank you. So unfortunately, that was a time-limited project. It came to an end, and then we were left scratching our heads about how we can actually, take the learning from that and absorb it into business as usual. So the last sort of 8 months has been very much focused on negotiating with our local integrated care board and one commissioner in particular who's incredibly engaged, and a former SLT. So thanks, Helen. And we looked at rather than the bolt-on service, putting additional resource into one of the community teams in the region, and using that person as a project coordinator to coordinate the delivery of intensive high-dose groups around region, using capacity from different teams. And it just so happens that we're in the process of merging our community teams in Essex to form a collaborative service. So that was quite beneficial, but it feels like something that could be done in any case. So we have a full-time experienced clinician acting as the project coordinator, and we have an assistant, part-time assistant, who's very focused on coordinating the tele-rehab project. So increasing dose to people in ESD and in community services alongside the work we're doing with group. So this goes hand in hand with processing how we're managing dysphagia differently. So in essence, we're trying to manage referrals with dysphagia in a much more streamlined approach and free capacity to give to the higher dose therapy groups for people with communication difficulties. And the way we're doing that is that we've developed these 10-minute video education programs. There's one that's very general. There are 3 that are tailored to mild difficulties associated with 3 conditions. So dementia, mild neurological changes, and then respiratory issues, COPD, breathing problems. So it's a negotiation. So during triage, we speak to people. We see if it's appropriate to send them this via a link. They watch it, and if they want further, they use the advice that's within the package, and if they want to be seen in person, then they just notify us via reply text or email, or give us a call. So we're hoping that by sort of delivering these kind of very, very early responses and education to people with dysphagia, we can find some capacity to give to our aphasia groups. So in summary, the Squire Catalyst project that we ran first found that libraries were a well-suited, free and receptive resource in which to situate our groups, that flexibility was key to the success of the groups. So we were finding creative solutions to different challenges. We had really good behavioural, functional and quality of life outcomes, and we found that there was economic value, and that was that economic value that we really grabbed onto and sort of used to sell to the ICB. I mean, and they're very, very conscious that it's all about outcomes really, but the economic benefits help. So the drawbacks to that project was it was specific to stroke. It was a small team, so we could only manage 10 groups in a year because we had to take our leave at the same time, and we were limited to the sort of ICSS period. So we stretched that a little bit, but really we couldn't see people who were sort of 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the line. So the new project is very much solving those, responding to those drawbacks. We're delivering the key elements of the group. We're focused very much on just the groups alone, the telerehabilitation project, increasing dose to people in ESD and thereafter. And we're focusing on supporting people with QSpeak. They're accessible to people with broader cognitive communication impairment and also to people with various acquired brain injuries, not just stroke. They're not limited to people in the first year of recovery. So there is the potential for people to come in twice, maybe even 3 times if they're responding well. And we hope that that we can reshape community delivery and offer high quality local alternatives to expensive specialist neurorehabilitation for those people that are principally speech and language therapy needs. And that is that. I've put some references on the slide, and I believe the slides will be available via RCSLT. Okay, thank you, everyone.
So thanks, everyone. Just to remind you, please do post questions on the Q&A. The speakers will respond to them after the end of the session, and then you'll be able to find their replies that they've posted. There's the session code if you're taking part in the challenge on the platform. But otherwise, thank you so much to all our speakers. It's been a great session, and I hope you have a good rest of the conference.